Hi, this video is about teaching measurement to elementary school students. It's going to focus on big picture ideas rather than specifics of measuring any kind of attribute. So what are some of the big ideas? The first is that measurement is actually more complicated than we might expect. It's really a three-step process. First, you need to decide on what attribute is to be measured. So let's say we're going to measure this bowling ball. Well, what do we want to measure? How high it is, how wide it is around, how much space it takes up, how much it weighs. We have to decide that. Let's say we want to just measure how much it weighs. We need to select a unit then. And you might say, well, of course you measured in pounds, but that's not the only unit that you can measure weight with. And so that's a decision that has to be made. And lastly, we're going to compare the units with the attribute of the object being measured. So we want to somehow compare how many of these 1 pound weights end up weighing the same as this bowling ball. And we can do that by putting them on a balance and putting enough weights on there until it balances out. Unfortunately, these three steps are often obscured for students. Often teachers just do number 1 and 2. They give them a bowling ball and say, measure how many pounds it is. That's doing number 1 and 2 for the students. Also, number 3 can be obscured by the measuring tool that's used instead of a balance. If it's on a scale, and just throw it on a scale and read the number. Kids don't get a sense of I'm weighing this bowling ball against pounds to see how much it weighs. So how can we help students learn about these three steps and therefore better understand what measuring is? We can introduce the idea of measurement with non-standard units. What do we mean? What's a non-standard versus a standard unit? Another example, let's say I said measure how long this shoe is. A standard unit would be inches. You put the ruler there and you see how many inches it is. Non-standard, you might say, I'm going to measure how many paper clips it is. And so you take this paper clip here and you line it up against the bottom of the shoe over and over again and you see how many paper clips long it is. That's a non-standard unit. Why would you bother doing that? There's some real advantages to using non-standard students, especially with young students who are just learning about measurement. They can really focus on the three steps. You can ask them, what should we measure about the shoe? How are we going to do that? What should we choose to measure it? What units are we going to use? When they have the paper clip in hand, they have to repeatedly line it up. They're learning that length is comparing it to how many units we have, how many paper clips. So focusing on what it means to measure comes through with non-standard units. The students can make some decisions in that process. In the end, using non-standard units also gives a motivation for transferring to standard units. If I use paper clips that are a little different size than yours, we might get two different measurements for the shoe. And who's right? How can we compare? Well, the answer is we pick a unit that's the same for everybody, like an inch, and then we all know. The disadvantages of doing this, it can weaken the consistency. For example, like I just said, two different length paper clips are going to give two different answers. So that can be a disadvantage if all we ever did was non-standard units. We wouldn't want to do that. Ultimately, we want the standard units. And it doesn't help build familiarity with standard measures. They won't get a sense of how long an inch is by measuring with paper clips. So ultimately, we want to get the standard units. The advantage is they're going to build familiarity with units that are used in the real world that everybody else uses. And also, standard units can be easier and more efficient to use. Instead of having to lay down copies all the time, we can put a ruler on there and more efficiently measure that shoe. But they need to have that underlying understanding of what that means, what they're doing. So the disadvantages of going too quickly to the standard units, it can confuse the three steps in their mind, confuse the goals of learning. Are they learning how to measure, or are they learning about inches? You want to have those things very clearly decided as you teach them. A sequence that we can help students learn to measure then. We start with very young students by making comparisons of measurements, looking at which of these two things is longer, but then we move into using non-standard units to learn about what it means to measure. Ultimately, the goal is to get to using standard units and measuring instruments to measure. How do we get there? We can bridge from the non-standard to the standard by having students create their own measuring instruments. So they take 1-inch strips and they glue them together into a ruler, and so they're very strongly connecting that process of repeating the units to create an instrument, and then that instrument has meaning for them as they use the standard units to measure.